Yeah, without traffic. Yeah. Jer možemo početi? Čujete nas? U redu. Dear colleagues, in very early morning hours we are starting a session, propaganda, news and the media. I'm convinced that this is one of the most interesting and intriguing topics of our conference. Before and during the First World War began modern propaganda. Shortly after the war also the rise of the radio, at that day's most important mass media. War has become so terrible that it could not longer be justified only by ordinary imperial objectives as until then. So it became necessary to justify it with defense of our civilization against barbarian enemies. What was once considered only for colonial people, it has now been refocused to the European nations. The First World War, because of that, also potentiate the old stereotypes or create new ones that are still very alive today. I would like to ask our speakers that at the beginning introduce themselves with two or three sentences. Our first speaker is Karl Kaser from Graz University. I know him for a long time, so for him I know that he is occupying with history of Southeast Europe from different aspects and with very interesting approaches. So, Karl, please.
Yeah, good morning to everybody. As Božo said, I'm professor for Southeast European History and Anthropology at the University of Graz. And a couple of years ago I started to be interested in visual culture or visual cultures of the region. And therefore, in my paper, I'm not so much interested in analyzing World War I and the Balkan Wars, but I'm rather interested in the function that these wars had on visual culture or aspects, elements of visual culture. So the Balkan Wars and World War I constituted the first media spectacles of the 20th century. They mark a transition from traditional forms of visual coverage of events, which predominantly consisted in paintings, cartoons and lithographs, to documentary media that should dominate the war reportage of the 20th century, namely press photography and the documentary film, which pretended to reproduce exact reality and truth. Photographical technology had matured significantly since 1839, when photography was invented, and the photo as newspaper coverage became popular at the beginning of the 20th century. This paved the way for the photo reportage as a profession. The introduction of the film in the middle of the 1890s, and especially the introduction of the newsreel at the beginning of the 20th century, enabled access to information for an auditory that was illiterate. My paper intends to position the three wars in the visual history of the Balkans. They pushed visual representation in a region that had been characterized by far-reaching abstinence from adaptation to visual modernity compared to the visual glamour of the industrial world. The first section will deal with the pre-secular understanding of images. The second one will investigate the role of war photography, newsreels, and documentaries in the Balkan Wars and World War I. The third one will address the obvious link between visual culture, external visual representation, Balkanism, and the wars in the Balkans. So I will move on to my first section, that is called Pre-Secular Understanding of Images. In the long pre-secular period, which lasted until the 19th and in some parts of the Balkans until the interwar period, the pictorial culture was religiously charged. While Orthodoxy elevated the holy icon sacred status, Judaism remained hostile, and Islam at least very skeptical to images. The emerging visual culture in the 19th century coincided with the distribution of the photographic picture and the beginnings of processes of secularization. The visual modernity of the West in form of the photography met the traditional pictorial traditions in the Balkans relatively unprepared and could not be linked to each other at the very beginning. The first reactions to the new method of producing pictures were predominantly negative. However, differentiations among denominations and regions seem to be appropriate. There were only a few local photographers who used the new pictorial technology in the first decades after its introduction. This data let us conclude that photography was far from being a mass phenomenon, even when the first silent movies were shown in the region in the middle of the 1890s. Further, the empirical data indicate that the import of Western visual technology on the whole was intensified only by the end of the 19th century. Architects, painters, sculptors, and actors were called from Western countries in order to transfer their know-how to the local students. Governments dispatched first generations of students to universities and art academies in Western countries for being trained, with the aim that the returnees will train a next generation. These are sufficient indications which support the thesis that Western-styled visual culture in the Balkans did not flourish until the beginning of the 20th century. In this context, we also have to consider that the visual pioneer technologies, photography and film, were not deeply rooted in the needs of the Balkan population, which was hardly touched by the invention of the first commercially suitable photo camera in 1839. The rejection of photography was very expressed among Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Muslims. Therefore, the first visual revolution did not take place before the early 20th century, and it remains questionable whether or not the mass of Jewish and Islamic population was part of it. However, the first photographs in the region should initiate a process that linked the population of the Balkan countries to the visual modernity of the West. Were the previous pictorial traditions relatively autonomous from Western influence? Now they were not any longer. So I come to my second section, photography, film and propaganda. The three wars were characterized by industrial warfare of not yet industrialized countries and resulted in the mobilization of all the national power reserves and in a previously unknown mobilization of the masses. The Balkan Wars were the first wars in the Balkans and Europe which were documented by photo postcards and photographs in newspapers. Thus, an initial stage of photojournalism was inaugurated by the Balkan Wars, which continued in World War I. The time span between shooting a photograph and the distribution of the newspaper with the photograph in it could be shortened remarkably. This changed the reading habits and expectations of consumers because the photograph was expected to represent true and authentic information. These observations harden my assumption that the two Balkan Wars of 1912-13 and the Great War, conditioned by war reporting and war propaganda, caused the first visual revolution in the Balkans. The number of published pictures and film strips began to explode since the fall of 1912, when the first Balkan War broke out, not only in the Balkans, but also in the Western countries. This was again the case when World War I broke out. The example of the Serbian war party demonstrates that the country was able to issue illustrated propaganda newspapers in the course of the two Balkan Wars, such as the Balkan War in pictures and words. In addition, the High Command engaged the 27-year-old Rista Marjanovic, who received his photographical training in the Parisian editorial office of the New York Herald for collecting and distributing visual information. He shot dramatic pictures on mobilization, marching off in the conquest of various cities until then under Ottoman administration. He is considered the first Serbian photo reporter. One interesting aspect of war photography is worth being mentioned. Since the beginning of war photography in the Crimean War, some societal and aesthetic taboos were observed, with few exceptions. No photographs with dead soldiers and war atrocities on them were displayed or published. One of the most remarkable exceptions of this rule was the investigation of causes and progress of the Balkan Wars by an international team of experts commissioned by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and published in 1914. What makes this powerful publication shocking are not the revealed empirical facts, but the 50 photographs shot by unknown photographers in the publication, which testified deaths, wound, and terrible devastation. Okay. The contribution of domestic film directors and cameramen to the great number of films was almost insignificant, but much more than the previous production. On the Serbian front, the Serbian film pioneer Joka Bogdanovic has to be mentioned. He was the owner of the cinema casino in Belgrade. His initial idea was to reenact Serbian victories of the First Balkan War. He hired two cameramen who worked for the Pate, the worldwide leading film producing and distributing company. In midst of the preparations in June 1913, the Second World War broke out. He gave up his initial plans and decided to produce films about the events of the Serbian front. His unknown cameraman filmed battle scenes, destroyed villages, victims, pioneers, prisoners of war, and the everyday life of soldiers, and prepared them to be screened as newsreels. The greatest achievement of domestic cameraman and filmmaker in the Balkan Wars was the documentary film Balkan War by the Bulgarian war correspondent Alexander Ivanov Zhekov. The remarkably 43 minutes long silent film is probably the first European war documentary. He utterly rightly is considered the pioneer of the Bulgarian documentary film. He began shooting on December 9, 1912 and finished probably in June 1913. He was director, producer, scenarist and film editor at the same time. The Great War was immediately related to the introduction of an organized film production in the Ottoman Empire. When the empire entered into the war in November 1914, the government had to take steps to popularize the entry after 3 wars in 3 years. The first step was to destroy the Russian monument in San Stefano that reminded the population to the humiliating preliminary peace treaty of 1878. And to photograph and to film the destruction. First, an Austrian-Hungarian company was commissioned to film. However, the final decision was for Fuad Uskene, an enthusiastic cineast who was reserve officer at the time. The only problem was that he had no experience with filming. Allegedly, he was quickly trained by Austrian experts and shot the blasting operation of the monument from 15 meters distance on November 14, 1914. Allegedly, the film was 150 meters long, disappeared shortly after shooting, or was never shot. So I come to my third and last section. Visual revolution and Balkanism. This visual revolution had insofar negative consequences as the pioneer media of photography and film became important instruments for the establishment of asymmetric visual power relations between the West and the Balkans. The Western media and film producers had sent their own photo reporters and film teams to the war theaters in the Balkans. Presumably, much more foreigners than locals acted in the visual business. As consequence, the West came into the position to construct its own specific image of the bellicose Balkans. Worldwide renowned film producing companies such as the French Pathé, Gaumont and Eclair, as well as the German Mester company, recorded every important event. In addition, the film companies Juris, Cines, Cinema Color and Tropical were present with their cameramen. In the course of the 2 Balkan Wars, 29 mostly Western film production companies at and behind the front were active and produced 109 newsreels. Approximately half of them were shot by cameramen of Pathé. The report of a Hungarian magazine informed the reader on October 13, 1912, that up to 50 cameramen were present in important events. Pathé began to implement the new newsreel system in Paris in 1908 and in whole France, Germany and England in 1909. In 1911, Pathé Weekly started to operate in the United States and attracted numerous American imitations. In Germany, the Balkan Wars resulted in an intensification of war reportage. The German Express Film Company brought the so-called The Day on Film, first German daily cinematographic reportage, on the market. With the permission of the Greek king, this new cinema format showed bayonet attacks of the infantry, cavalry, patrols, shooting at artillery, and activities of the Red Cross. This suggests that the infrastructure was prepared for the transmission of the events of the Balkan Wars and World War I to the rest of the world. The hypothesis is justified that the more than 100 newsreels shot in the Balkan Wars and an unknown figure in the Great War was consumed by mass auditory in Western countries. For instance, Great Britain had approximately 5,000 cinemas in 1914. The working class was already the numerically dominant film-going public. In July 1916, 20 million tickets were sold per week. These figures let us assume a mass consumption of the Balkan Wars and the events of the Great War in the Balkans, probably not worldwide, but at least European-wide. In summing up, we can state a temporal coincidence of emerging visual modernity in the Balkans and the 6 war years from 1912 to 1918. This wars produced a serious incentive for local and foreign photographers and filmmakers. The visual evidence suggests that the Balkan Wars triggered the innovation of traditional visual culture in the region. As it looks like, the participation in photography was limited to the urban bourgeois strata in the whole 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. The majority of population seemed not to be very enthusiastic about the new media. One of the fundamental reasons for that was the economic situation of the rural population, which prevented the countryside from becoming part of the visual enterprise. The wars from 1912 to 1918, with their visual propaganda machineries, seem to constitute a threshold range towards a popularization of visual presentation beyond the urban bourgeois strata. To call this a visual revolution is therefore no exaggeration. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thanks for this very fresh and guest presentation. I know that Karl is making a great collection of materials from this area, and so the best is yet to come, I guess, in next months. Well, I suggested that you replace the seats, because
Yes.
it's a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm sorry if you want to make it. So the next speaker is Elisabeth Haid, the clash between two worlds, support of the war in Austrian and Russian newspapers in the First World War. So, Elisabeth.
Thank you. I'm doing my PhD in Vienna about Austrian and Russian press reporting on Galicia in the First World War, and so now I'm presenting one aspect of my PhD research. In August 1914, a wave of enthusiasm for war swept over Europe and inspired especially the middle classes. In this process, newspapers played an important role. This enthusiasm, on the one hand, was reflected in media coverage. On the other hand, media coverage stoked the enthusiasm for war. Press reporting ranged between an enthusiasm of the moment and selective propaganda campaigns which supported the interest of the state and motivated the people for war. Comments against the war were suppressed by censorships. So the aim of this paper is to trace such pro-war press campaigns in Austrian and Russian newspapers of different political orientation. In general, Austrian and Russian press reporting resembled each other in many respects. In some cases, differences between newspapers of different political orientation seem to be more important than differences between Austrian and Russian press reporting. On the one hand, they slightly differed in their attitudes towards the war. In both countries, several newspapers, for example the Austrian conservative Reichspost, advocated a military intervention already during the July crisis. Others, like for example the Russian liberal newspaper Edin, initially argued for avoiding an armed conflict. For this reason, the Edin was temporarily suppressed after the outbreak of war. However, 2 days later, it reappeared and now joined in the patriotic rhetoric supporting the war. Socialist newspapers which disapproved the war were not permitted to appear in Russia until the February Revolution of 1917. The Viennese socialist newspaper Arbeiterzeitung expressed a moderate enthusiasm for war in August 1914. On the other hand, the political orientation influenced also the line of reasoning. Based on the press coverage in the capitals of the two empires, I will compare different political, cultural and religious conceptions supporting the war. I will illustrate the different argumentative strategies on the basis of the reporting on Galicia. Also, Galicia clearly ranked below the Balkans in public attention before the war. From a political point of view, this multicultural border province was a key issue in the relations between Austria and Russia already in the pre-war period. The tensions relating to Galicia originated from its strategic importance as well as from nationality issues concerning the so-called Polish and Ukrainian questions. With the outbreak of war, press reporting started to pay a great deal of attention to this region, where one of the first major battles of World War I evolved. So Galicia was affected by multiple boundary changes, and large parts of eastern Galicia were conquered by the Russian army twice. In press reporting, Galicia on the one hand became an important war aim, which was especially in the focus of Russian nationalist newspapers. On the other hand, it was seen as an important theatre of war, that is, as the scene of the clash of the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the first days after the declaration of war, both Austrian and Russian newspapers predominantly emphasized the defensive character of the war, laying blame for the cause of the war on the enemy. Russian press reporting underlined that it was Austria-Hungary who declared the war on Russia, and citing the manifesto of the Tsar, they blamed Austria-Hungary for being the, quote, initiator of the global disturbances, end of quote. In contrast, Austrian newspapers presented Russia as the aggressor, suspecting it of being the initiator of Franz Ferdinand's assassination. They supposed that Russia's main goal in the war was to annihilate the Habsburg monarchy. Both Russian and Austrian press reporting appealed to patriotic feelings for the defense of the home country. However, pretty soon press campaigns supporting the war referred on defensive as well as on offensive war aims. They mentioned specific territorial claims as well as intentions to weaken the enemy and to consolidate one's own position in Europe. In doing so, they frequently idealized these aims as moral goals and hyperbolized the war as a clash between two opposite worlds. In this respect, the Austrian and the Russian press attached a particular importance to the struggle between the two empires. They emphasized the absolute imperative to defend one's own world and justified the conquest of territory as a moral commitment in terms of a civilizing mission or a struggle for liberation from a foreign yoke. Conceptions about a deep antagonism between the warring parties can be found in newspapers of different political orientation. However, they highlighted different aspects of this dichotomy. In the conservative press, religion played an important role in order to motivate the people for war. Austrian and Russian newspapers expressed their confidence in the divine succor for the war and referred to the divine right of their emperor. Furthermore, religion was an important criterion to define the boundary of one's own world. In this respect, conservative press reporting presented the clash between the Austrian and the Russian empires in terms of an antagonism between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. According to this view, the war was also a struggle for faith. Concerning this matter, Austrian and Russian newspapers often referred to the religious situation in Galicia, accusing the enemy of corruptive religious propaganda in this border region. Russian nationalists, for example, based their justification for the conquest of eastern Galicia largely on the Greek Catholics in Galicia, whom they considered to be, in fact, Orthodox. They appealed to the liberation of the Orthodox brothers, which were suppressed by Catholic Poles and Austrians. However, this antagonism between Catholicism and Orthodoxy often was closely connected to cultural or national conceptions. Secular models of this dichotomy were common in newspapers of virtually all political orientations. Austrian newspapers based their cultural demarcations mainly on the opposition of civilization or barbarism. They contrasted European Western civilization with barbarian Asian Russia, arguing with religion and history, as well as with literacy rate, democracy, and national consciousness as attributes of the West. Accordingly, they motivated the people for the war against Russia in means of the idea of a defensive war against the so-called threat from the East. They presented the Central Powers as a bulwark of Europe and its culture. Although the idea of a defensive war played a crucial role in press reporting, Austrian newspapers justified also offensive war aims in means of a struggle between civilization and barbarism. They appealed for the liberation of European peoples like the Poles from the dominance of the Russian barbarians, for their reunification with Europe and for the promotion of Western values and democracy. Liberal newspapers and the Socialist Arbeiterzeitung especially highlighted the goal of the struggle against despotism. Russian newspapers also used cultural conceptions in order to support defensive as well as offensive war aims. They predominantly argued with an antagonism between an aggressive Germanic world and a harmonious Slavic world. They warned about the German thrusts towards the east and promoted a union of all Slavs and their liberation from the Austrian-German yoke. Concrete conceptions of the unity of the Slavs, however, differed depending on political orientation. While the right-wing press favored the idea of a Russian hegemony and suspected the Polish and the Ukrainian national movements of pursuing a policy of separatism, liberals advocated Slavic solidarity on the basis of nationality rights. Whereas some liberal newspapers predominantly criticized the Germanization policies of the German Empire, some right-wing newspapers mainly opposed the multicultural Austrian Empire and accused the Austrian authorities of initiating such separatist national movements among the Slavs in order to divide the Slavic people and to weaken it. Also from a German point of view, the war often was described as a struggle for existence between the Germanic world and the Slavic world. This idea was popular among German nationalists in Austria as well. However, Austrian authorities rejected this concept because of the high percentage of Slavs within the Habsburg monarchy. Therefore, in Austrian press reporting, this antagonism between Germans and Slavs hardly played any role. Besides these concepts of two opposite worlds, both multinational empires concretely appealed to national feelings of different nationalities within their own and the enemy state. Indeed, appeals to the Poles, Ukrainians, or so-called Galician Russians often tied in with this the dichotomous concepts in as much as they conveyed a sense of belonging to the Western civilization or to the Slavic world. On the other hand, Austria and Russia tried to motivate ethnic minorities for the war by promising to fulfill their national desires. One example is the manifesto to the Polish nation by Grand Duke Nicholas, who promised the reunification of the Polish lands under the patronage of the Russian Tsar. Another example is the creation of the Polish legions as an independent formation of the Austro-Hungarian army. Furthermore, Austrian newspapers pointed to the anti-Ukrainian politics of the Russian Empire in order to win the Ruthenians or Ukrainians over for the cause of the Central Powers. Russian newspapers, on the other hand, were divided about the Ukrainian question. Russian nationalists campaigned for the liberation of the so-called Galician Russians, counting on a Russian national identity of the Galician Ruthenians, as well as on the compassion of the Russian public for their suppressed Galician brothers. The liberal Reich, in contrast, criticized Russia's nationality politics, which suppressed the Ukrainian movement in Russia as well as in occupied Galicia. But although the liberal newspaper rejected the pretensions of Russian nationalists, it supported the war against the Central Powers, raising hopes that Russian nationality politics would change under the influence of the Western allies, and that Russia would become a real protector of the nationality rights of all Slavs. To conclude, Austrian and Russian newspapers of different political orientation supported the war to varying degrees. They referred on defensive as well as an offensive war aims, on the interests of the state or of a certain civilization, as well as on the interest of certain nationalities. They frequently idealized these aims as moral goals in terms of a civilizing mission or a struggle for national liberation. Press reporting relied on different political, cultural, and religious and national conceptions. These various conceptions sometimes conflicted, but often complemented and supported one another. Thank you.
Thanks. now, as you see, we are still in ordinary European war disputes, like the defense of our civilization against barbarian enemies and similar. So spreading of democracy all over the world will only come a few years later with Wilson's points and then the USA war. The next our speaker is Werner Suppanz. The title of his paper is Serbia Must Die, on the representation and memories of the Serbian front in Austria during World War I and the interwar period. It will take, I guess, a minute or two to prepare PowerPoint.
Yes. 1 minute.
Excuse us for a moment.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Voilà.
Slideshow.
Slideshow, okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. My name is Werner Suppanz. I'm working at the University of Graz at the Institute of History in the area of contemporary history. In my paper, I want to start with some introductory remarks and then stress on 4 central points. First, an evaluation of Austria-Hungary's fronts during and after the war, the perception of the fronts in Austria, the various fronts in Austria-Hungary. The second point, the characteristic topoi of the war on the Balkans. Then I want to present a counter-narrative, namely Karl Kraus's The Last Days of Mankind, that monumental play by Karl Kraus on the First World War. And in the final concluding chapter, I want to talk about the Balkanist elements of this perception of the Serbian front and some middle and long-term effects of and in remembrance and oblivion of the Serbian front. Unlike the previous panelists, I will not stress on a systematical investigation of a certain kind of representation, but rather focus on content and discourse analysis in various forms of representation with respect to the formation, the formulation of collective memory narratives. My paper starts from the observation that there is a remarkable difference between the overwhelming impact of Franz Ferdinand's assassination on 28th of June in 1914 on the public emotions, as I want to call it, in Austria and the Habsburg monarchy as a whole, and as a consequence, the readiness to wage war on Serbia and the importance of the Southeastern Front in the representations and remembrance of World War I already during and even more after 1918. In fact, very soon, as we see, Serbia changed from the deadly enemy to that of the second-rank rival. In other words, in the course of the war, the front in southeastern Europe became a secondary theater of war, as Karl Kraus stated in The Last Days of Mankind. This statement refers not only to its military importance, but even more to media coverage, emotional perception, and its symbolical role in warfare. A process
that continued after 1918. But with these words, I address only the official level of representation. The above-mentioned author, Karl Kaser, is an example for a counter-narrative that takes the war on Serbia as an example for the atrocities of the First World War, and in particular of Austro-Hungarian warfare, which is of primary interest for Karl Kaser. Narrative, however, that will get a topical quality only decades later, after the year 2000, mainly due to the books of Anton Holzer, an Austrian historian, that describe, by means of the examination of photos, the awareness of a brutalized war with characteristics of a colonial war. Therefore, I want to start now with the first chapter, the evaluation of Austria-Hungary's fronts during the war and after 1918. Austria-Hungary's World War began with hate against Serbia, as it was expressed in the Austrian media and by the crowds in the streets on 28 June 1914 and throughout July. Serbian muss sterben, Serbia must die, as it was said in a contorted expression, Serbian instead of sterben. Still, on 16th December 1914, the Neue Freie Presse wrote, as you see it, this is a part of the article in the part below. It writes, the campaign in Serbia is our war, ist eben unser Krieg. A war of retaliation for evil years, a war of minor importance for Europe and for the big decisions, but that has always been all of major importance for our feelings. So you can see we have already the feelings on an objective level in the framework of all the warfaring states and nations. It is of secondary importance. But for Austria-Hungary, as it was stated in December 1914, it is still the decisive, emotionally decisive point of the war. The frame of interpretation is obviously a primarily emotional one. However, that politics of emotions provoked at the same time the reduction of the importance of the front against Serbia later on. First, the war against Russia was increasingly represented as a decisive challenge, the clash of the great powers that was to decide the outcome of the war and the destiny of the Habsburg monarchy. Second, after May 1915, even the Titanic, as it was described in press and propaganda, character of the Russian front lost importance due to the beginning of the war against Italy. One can observe that the war against Italy became the front that began to form the essence of the World War from the Austrian point of view. The reason is that the Southwestern Front, as it was called, was close to the core land of the Habsburg monarchy, and moreover, from the point of view of the German-speaking parts of Cisleithania, it was that front that menaced German territory. Therefore, the memory of the war after 1918 in the interwar period as a whole was primarily, in Austria, the memory of the war against Italy, and in fact it was marked by a hegemonic feel of loss of German territory as it was seen in South Tyrol. Now, on the characteristic topoi of the war on the Balkans. Even though the remembrance of the war against Serbia was of minor importance in the interwar period, its interpretation and representation between 1914 and 1918 is a cardinal point in a long-term perspective on Serbia and southeastern Europe in Austria. I want to stress several typical elements. The first one, the topos of the punitive expedition. After Franz Ferdinand's assassination, the wish to wage war on Serbia was dominated by the discourse on punishment. The campaign against Serbia was promoted as punitive expedition, a notion that differed from the concept of a regular war and always expressed the hierarchy between powers that were in conflict. As you can see in the text of the Austrian newspaper Neue Freie Presse on the part above, Belgrade is the human factor in this war. In the Serbian stance of vice was king what now has come over the peoples, and every soldier that comes home wounded, and every mother that fears for the son and whose heart beats when she hears about battles, and every orphan child, and all those who experience pain or are depressed by grief are thinking with bitter rancor of the king's palace, where an old man laden with sins conspired against the peace of the world. Though a sinful Serbian dynasty has to bear the guilt of the world war. That's the message of this article, and this fact has to be punished from the point of view of the Austrian press. In the 19th century, punitive expeditions were started against colonies and against powers of minor importance. I want to stress another case, a campaign against Italy in May and June 1916, which is still today known in Italy by its Austrian nickname as La Strafexpedition, the punitive expedition. A second topos I want to stress, the topos of the undistinguishability of military and civilians in the war on Serbia. From the beginning, and already in the war planning before July 1914, the war against Serbia was seen and expected to be as a front where civil population and soldiers tend to be identical. The consequence was that the Serbian population as a whole, including women and men of all ages, was considered as enemy. War against Serbia included, therefore, from the beginning, war against its civil population. That means taking hostages, burning villages, arbitrary executions. That brutalized concept of colonial war was comparable mainly to the attitude of the German occupation army in Belgium and the image of the Belgian partisan that legitimized as well brutality against the civil population. Of course, contorted images of the enemies, including Frenchmen and Englishmen, were part of the wartime propaganda as a whole. However, the character of the Serbian population was to a particular degree described according to models of barbarian colonial peoples. An example is a press article from September 1914 in the Grazer Vororte Zeitung on the Serbian women, the struggling Serbian women, where Serbian women are accused of, for example, having killed their own child because of having accepted chocolate from an Austrian soldier, or the help for a pregnant Serbian woman who shoots an hour later on Austrian hussars. So we have this colonial barbarian image promoted widely in the course of the war against Serbia. I want to present now a counter-narrative that puts all this into doubt and in some kind shows the Austrian side is not the better side in that fight, in the form of Karl Kaser's play Last Days of Mankind, The Last Days of Mankind. No? Okay. Already during the war and in the early interwar period, the Austrian writer and journalist Karl Kaser, born 1874, died 1936, the editor of Die Fackel, The Torch, wrote his satirical and monumental play with over 700 pages, The Last Days of Mankind. Between 1915 and 1922, here you see a version published in 1919. The final complete version was published in 1922. It is to a high degree based on documentary sources combined in the technique of literary collage and aims to represent Austria-Hungary's warfare just by reproducing documents, oral statements and observations in the streets of Austrian cities during the war. It starts from the satirical description of hate and resentment in the press and by the men in the streets, and anti-Serbian riots by the simple men in the streets. But soon a person in the play states, Serbian is ein Nebenkriegsschauplatz. Serbia is a secondary theater of war. Krause's aim is to deconstruct the image of a noble and just war, and the Serbian is his example. Not his only one, but the one that offers all the attributes of war atrocities. In the fifth act, he lets talk a Captain Brasch, who tells, I am born from Graz. I shot down on the spot everyone I encountered in Serbia. By my own hand, I killed 20 people, among them civilians and prisoners. At least 150 people I ordered to execute. And later on, in Serbia, I violated a Serbian girl, but then I delivered her to the soldiers, and on the next day I ordered to hang the girl and her mother on the balustrade of a bridge. It is not Krause's intention to invert the roles in that war, but to unmask assertions of moral or cultural superiority on the Austro-Hungarian side. In the long way, this play, for this reason, proves to be a storage of the remembrance of the First World War, of a counter-narrative that gets lost for many decades and is rediscovered, one can say, only in the last 10 to 20 years, and rediscovered also by Austrian historiography. So to my last point, the point on Balkanism and middle-term and long-term effects on remembrance of living after 1918. As described above, a longer continuity of Balkanism formed the expectations and interpretations of the war against Serbia on the Austrian side. The perception of the campaigns in Serbia on the other side seemed to confirm the Balkanistic framing of the war experience. However, as mentioned above, the memory of the war after 1918, above all with respect to its emotional ascription of meanings focused on the Italian front. The hegemonic narrative in Austria of the World War was a heroic one. Only the Social Democrats stressed the atrocious character of the war in their counter-narrative. The war is crime of the Habsburg dynasty. But their predominance centered only in a few areas of social democracy majority, like, above all, the Red Vienna. Finally, the Austro-fascist regime enforced the narrative of the World War as a great, heroic and noble one on the side of the Habsburg armies. However, the anti-heroic narrative of the war was present. It was even predominant on a regional and local level, but in the end it vanished with the destruction of the left opposition to the Austro-Fascist government in 1933-34. One consequence of the heroic narrative was the reduction of the view on the war to its military aspects. The entanglement of war and society, the total war, was another factor in the process of selective oblivion. With it, the remembrance of phenomena like the civilian internment camps in the hinterland and violence against civilian population was oppressed. So, along with the focus on the Italian front in the collective memory, that process was another element of the disregard of the Serbian campaign and the oblivion of its characteristics between 1918 and 1938. That development referred also to Austrian soldiers. While above all heroic deeds of the soldiers in the Dolomites and at the Isonzo received praise, for example, the destiny of the considerable number of Austro-Hungarian war prisoners in Serbia who was forced to accompany the Great Retreat never entered the collective memory. So this oblivion doesn't affect not only the Serbian side of the war, but also the destiny of Austrian soldiers. That process, however, was accompanied by the persistence of the Balkanistic framing of war experience in the communicative memory. From the perspective of the post-war period after 1945, the characteristics of Nazi Germany's war in Yugoslavia are often narrated as new and unprecedented. In Austrian collective memory, therefore, there is a distinct image of war in southeastern Europe, connected, however, exclusively to war in Yugoslavia during World War II. It contains all the elements we have discussed before. So, that it's new and unprecedented, this is true with respect to the intensity and degree of atrocities, and of course also to the anti-Semitic furor of Nazi Germany's warfare. However, bringing back the Austro-Hungarian war on Serbia into the functional memory, the hot memory, to mention Aleida Assmann, can make aware that its features were not new and surprising, but are based on imaginations of war on the Balkans formed by the First World War. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to Werner for this really interesting presentation, not just of propaganda, but also of its consequences, especially to remind us to our crowd. The next our speaker is Edin Omerčić. His paper is The Great War on the television National Geographic magazine 1914-1919. Edin is in Thank
you, Božo. Just before I start, I have to tell you that I'm not going to speak in English.
Microphone.
I'm not going to speak in English. So I have to prepare my presentation. Just because my paper is in Bosnian, so I have in mind.
Okay. Je li u redu sada?
This one is working. Does it work? Thank you very much. Ovako, prije nego što počnem da se predstavim, moje ime je Edin Omerčić, radim kao stručni saradnik na Institutu za istoriju u Sarajevu i bavim se periodom postsocijalizma, posljednjeg rata, agresije na Bosnu i Hercegovinu, domovinskog rata, ili, kako to neki zovu, ratova za jugoslovensko nasljeđe. I želim se zahvaliti prije svega svim organizatorima, da sad ne nabrajam, na prilici i na ovoj konferenciji, na prilici koju sam dobio da vam prezentiram ovaj svoj rad. National Geographic Society je osnovano krajem 19. stoljeća, a kroz svoj časopis ima zadatak povećati i proširiti znanje o geografiji uopće, te popularizirati putovanja i istraživanja. Sluteći kako će rat koji je otpočeo u Europi biti bez premca u historiji, uredništvo časopisa se tokom 1914. kao i 15. fokusiralo na teme kojima je nastojalo približiti i tumačiti ovaj ispočetka europski sukob. Članovima društva i pretplatnicima diljem svijeta nastoje prvo na neposredan način fotoreportažama iz europskih država te političkim kartama Europe prikazati i tumačiti stanje prije rata, a potom i ratno stanje te promjene koje se dešavaju na starom kontinentu. Stereotipi i odsutnost preciznosti dopisnika magazina, među kojima je veliki broj vojnih lica, su u ovim tekstovima neizbježni i idejno politički obojeni. Kroz 14. magazin nam donosi zanimljive fotoreportaže o svakodnevici i stanju u nekoliko europskih zemalja, Francuskoj, Belgiji, Ugarskoj, Engleskoj, strancima u SAD-u, potom o problemu rasta europske populacije, te o njemačkoj naciji. O Rusiji se kao zemlji ogromnih mogućnosti pisalo na poseban način i problem Rusije se tretira i njeguje na jedan poseban način i upadljivo se više izvještava iz Rusije, naročito tokom 18. godine u odnosu na ostale evropske zemlje. Iako početkom 1915. godine još nije bilo ni izravnog ni javnog američkog uplitanja u ratno zbivanje u Europi, Sjedinjene Američke Države su do aprila 17. godine bile sve samo ne neutralne. Elita društva, pod utjecajem visoko efektivne britanske propagande, favorizira od prvih početaka rata saveznika. Uredništvo magazina nastoji da donese reportaže sa frontovske pozadine, reportaže iz februara 15. u kojoj je pisano o ribarnicama na Sjevernom moru i tome kako rat ugrožava snabdijevanje stanovništva Europe ribljim namirnicama, bila je prva u nizu koja se bavila problemom snabdijevanja stanovništva i vojske, te američkoj ulozi i doprinosu u rješavanju ovog bitnog pitanja. Tokom narednih godina sve do 19. bilo je određenih brojeva magazina koji su bili isključivo posvećeni ovom pitanju. Treba se naglasiti da je tokom 14. i 15. da se časopis držao svoje prvobitne svrhe, zadataka i ciljeva. Još uvijek nema, što je nekako i razumljivo, otvorene ratne propagande, ali je frazeologija tekstova primjetno ratnička. Na primjer, prilog iz septembra pod naslovom The Warfare on our Eastern Coast, ratovanje na našoj istočnoj obali, na 45 stranica sa fotografijama govori zapravo o ratu vode i kopna, maritimnosti. Ali kada ovome dodate propagandne postere koji nisu vezani za ovaj časopis, a koji su prikazivali dolazak zvijeri koja predstavlja Njemačku na američko tlo, onda nema sumnje da se radi o određenom stepenu ratne psihoze. Pojedinim prilozima tokom 15. u pisanje časopisa se uvlači i novi faktor, vojnik i vojska. Vojnički poziv, vojna služba je veliku promociju imao naročito tokom 18. godine, kada je u nizu priloga pisano o američkim dobrovoljcima, vojničkom životu i njihovoj ulozi i značaju za američki, takav način života. Treba naglasiti da je 1916. godina svojevrsni prelaz prema američkom direktnom angažmanu u ratna dešavanja. O ratnim se prilikama piše mnogo manje, tek kroz nekoliko reportaža, i ova nam činjenica govori nešto i o previranju unutar američke administracije, unutar opozicionih struja. Iz svega rečenog vidljivo je da se kroz časopis može pratiti široki spektar tema. Ja sam nastojao da se koncentrišem na problem propagande i mobilizacije. Odlučan skok uređivačke politike dešava se kroz 1917. godinu, kada pisanje časopisa postaje isključivo vojno-politički angažovano. Citiram, unatoč brojnim izrazima otpora prema sudjelovanju u ratu, program američke vlade je uspješno potaknuo javno mnijenje prema ovom cilju. Propaganda je uspješno korištena kako bi se kanalizirao patriotski osjećaj u prevazilaženju stoljetne averzije nemiješanja u evropske sukobe. Što više, njime se uspjeva u ujedinjenju nacionalne podrške u smjeru ciljeva koje je zacrtao George Creel, direktor odbora o javnom informiranju, ili skraćeno Committee for Public Informations. Kroz časopis je tokom 17. godine uredništvo davalo prije svega podršku odluci o ulasku Sjedinjenih Američkih Država u rat, a teme o kojima se piše u časopisu više se gotovo i ne tiču geografije, već imaju svrhu sredstva vojno-političke mobilizacije. Tako je u aprilskom broju 17. U cijelosti pod naslovom Do your bit for America, daj svoj doprinos za Ameriku, štampana proklamacija predsjednika Wilsona američkom narodu. Kroz fotografiju, malo evo, ću nastojati pokazati na koji je način na koji je način povezivan ovaj ratni angažman 1917. godine sa američkom revolucijom i nasljeđem i tekovinama američke revolucije. U časopisu ova fotografija je snimljena na trgu u Njujorku i predstavlja vojnika, patriotu, kako stoji ispod fotografije, koji je prožet patriotizmom heroja revolucije Nathana Hale'a, spomenik je za Nathana Hale'a, kojemu su, dok je vođen na streljanje, posljednje riječi koje je izgovorio bile žaljenje za samo jednim životom koji će dati i koji može dati za svoju zemlju. Jel? Ali ne stoji da su ga na streljanje zapravo odveli Britanci, sad budući saveznici. Jel? Ova fotografija predstavlja trg nezavisnosti u Filadelfiji, na kojem se okupilo hiljade patriotskih raspoloženih Amerikanaca koji su rezolutno izrazili bezrezervnu podršku predsjedniku. Citiram, u bilo kakvoj akciji u domenu njegovih ustavnih ovlasti koje smatra potrebnima za zaštitu američkih prava nad zemljom i morem. Zato što je zajednička odbrana ujedno i zajednička dužnost. Univerzalna vojna obuka je jedini sistem koji je iz temelja demokratski pravedan. Apelujemo na Kongres da utječe na to da ovaj sistem odmah stupi na snagu. Propagandna kampanja se u magazinu dijelom uklapa u obrazac koji je profesorica Pearl James iznijela u uvodu zbornika radova pod naslovom Picture This, a u kojem se govori o vizualnoj kulturi i mobilizatorskim posterima u Prvom svjetskom ratu. Ja sam koristio izdanje Nebraska Universitya iz 2009. godine. Prema navedenom propagandnom obrascu, nakon vojnog poziva, prvo slijede poziv muškarcima i novcu za služenje domovini i Bogu. Slijede drugo, pozivi za pomoć borcima na fronti, ranjenicima, nemoćnima, potom treće, pozivi ženama za veći angažman i doprinos vojnim nastojanjima, te na kraju finalni poziv za posljednju žrtvu svakog pojedinca. Dok su regrutni posteri za različite agencije u SAD-u načinjeni i štampani prije aprila 17. godine, važniju ulogu od njih samih imala je distribucija narativa, kojima su Njemci opisivani kao barbari i militaristi, a njihovi vođe kao demonski despoti, vojska i vojnici kao krvožedni silovatelji i direktna prijetnja američkim idealima, pa i američkom tlu. Ovi su narativi važni jer su pripremili tlo emotivno angažovanom propagiranju i približili ove stereotipe masovnoj publici i konzumentima. Ovo je citat članka Kazetskog i Liblanga iz istog časopisa 2009. godine. A ovakav se narativ provlači kroz članke u magazinu. Propagandnu akciju pridobijanja američkog stanovništva za intervenciju u političke prilike izvan SAD-a i Evropski rat koje su slijedile kroz sadržaj National Geographic magazina možemo sagledati i podijeliti u dvije vrste. Prva je ona koja se vrši u objavljenim radovima, samim prilozima i člancima u časopisu, kojima je cilj bio proces homogenizacije američkog stanovništva još nije bio završen, znači homogenizacija stanovništva i daljnji stepen u procesu izgradnje supernacije. I ona je rezultat rada i nastojanja samog uredništva. Ova fotografija Paula Thompsona predstavlja branioce slobode koji marširaju 5. avenijom. Objašnjenje ispod fotografije kaže da je Amerika u bespoštednoj školi iskustva otkrila kako se Njemačka bori tajnim oružjem na našim granicama, kao i krvlju i željezom na linijama fronta. Dalje se govori o Rusiji i Italiji kao o zemljama koje su na neki način malo uradile ili nisu dovoljno uradile kao samo malo. Nije ni toliko važno. Činjenica koja potvrđuje ovu tvrdnju o neprijatelju na granicama se kroz časopis pored narativa o Njemcima kao Hunima provlači narativ koji možemo svesti na tlapnju, kako su saveznici dobri, ali ne toliko dobri kao što su sami Amerikanci, kao što smo mi, naše stanovništvo. Jednako tako su i država i privatni privredni sektor uspješno koristili reklamni prostor sa druge strane, pored ovih pisanja u člancima, u kojem su kroz svoje oglase s jedne strane pozivale američke građane u službu, ali s druge strane i oglašavale prodaju, recimo država svojih državnih obveznica u nekoliko krugova ili privatne kompanije proizvod ili svoju uslugu koju nudi. Pri čemu su strategijom uvjeravanja igrali na kartu emocija čitatelja i potencijalnog konzumenta ili regruta. A sa druge strane, tim potezom iskazivale su podršku ratnoj političkoj opciji, od koje su obje strane imale nekakvu uzajamnu korist. Posebno su zanimljive teme i motivi propagiranja i iskorištavanja, to je prije malo spomenuo i kolega, uloge žene i majke u vojno-političke svrhe kao iskorištavanje djeteta u navedene svrhe. Ja sam postavio pitanje, je li ovo u stvari La Pieta, kip koji predstavlja majku sa sinom u naručju, a ovdje se radi o reklamnom posteru Crvenog križa, koji kaže najveća majka svijeta pruža ruke svima u nevolji, naravno ako su na savezničkoj strani, u savezničkim redovima. Citiram, Jevrejima i nejevrejima, crnima i bijelima, bez favoriziranja jer voli sve. Ona grije hiljade, hrani hiljade, liječi hiljade iz svoje radnje, iz svoje kase. Najveća majka svijeta, Crveni krst križ. Kraj citata. Direktna marketinško-propagatorska poruka čitatelju za investiranje u američke državne obveznice, reklamu koju je za pobjedu u ratu sponzorirala firma koji proizvodi automobilske pneumatike, kroz motiv majke u iščekivanju povratka sina sa fronte, čiji se, citiram u mom slobodnom prijevodu uvijek, patriotizam, odanost ne može mjeriti pukim dolarima jer ona je dala sve. Krv svoga srca i svoju dušu. A od tebe je samo traženo da pozajmiš i da si dao sav svoj novac koji imaš i za koji se nadaš da ćeš imati, to ne bi bilo ništa spram njene žrtve. A tebe se traži da investiraš u najbolje svjetsko osiguranje. Sljedeća fotografija na kojoj djeca koračaju kostimirana u Uncle Sama propagirala američke ratne markice, čijom se kupnjom pomaže ujaku Semu, a odmaže Kajseru. na način da se, citiram u slobodnom prijevodu, kupnjom jedne markice u vrijednosti $4,16 u Kajsera može ispaliti 100 puščanih metaka. S 4 kupljene markice će se proizvesti puška za jednog od naših momaka, a jedan certifikat sa 20 markica snosit će troškove proizvodnje 2 dubinskih bombi koje će potopiti podmornicu. 10 takvih certifikata će nahraniti posadu razarača koji prati naše brodove na putu za Europu. Tokom 17. i 18. godine se pored navedenog piše i razmatraju problemi ratne privrede, snabdijevanja stanovništva i vojske hranom, o čemu sam malo ranije natuknuo, dostave novog ratnog materijala, tehničkih sredstava i ljudstva. Piše se o pitanju regrutacije, o neophodnim energentima, slavi se republičko uređenje, sloboda i demokratija, donose se reportaže o američkim pripremama za slanje vojnika u Europu, kao i reportaže sa područja koja su zahvaćena ratnim dešavanjima i same pozadine fronte, koja je u fokusu javnosti. Prenose se javne obraćanja savezničkih velikodostojnika i tako dalje. Istakao sam već da je direktni američki angažman u ratna dešavanja iskoristila marketinška industrija koja je našla svoj interes u američkim ratnim ciljevima. Tako da se u reklamnom prostoru časopisa javljaju motivi kojima je reklamna industrija propagirala rat, ali istovremeno je prodavala proizvode. Čest je slučaj da se, na primjer, reklame za masivne nadgrobne spomenike skupog kamena i luksuzne automobile te ostale simbole dostignutog američkog načina života sa svojim patetičnim sloganima stoje na istoj stranici do vapaja za nužnim doprinosom američkih građana, pozivima na štednju i reciklažu prirodnih resursa u svrhu pomaganja ujako svemu našim dečkima i časnim saveznicima u Europi. Isto je tako zanimljivo, gotovo izuzetak, da je recimo jedna kampanja njemačkog imigranta koja se bavila prodajom krznenih odjevnih predmeta, superiorne kvalitete i karakterističnog stila, zakupljivala čitavu stranicu reklamnog prostora, a da pri tome nije koristila nikakve političko-mobilizatorske slogane. I ova je firma prisutna na reklamnom prostoru magazina i prije i poslije rata. Jel? Na kraju, ukratko, možemo zaključiti kako su politika uredništva kao i reklamni prostor koji je u časopisu bio na raspolaganju javnosti gotovo u potpunosti tokom čitavog ratnog razdoblja isključivo bili angažirani i imali određenu ulogu u strateškom promicanju i artikuliranju američkih nacionalnih ciljeva tokom Velikog rata. Propagandni prostor časopisa je za razliku od predratnog razdoblja uvećan, a izbrojao broj kroz čitavo ratno razdoblje uglavnom je bio zakupljen i korišten od istih državnih agencija, kao i firmi u privatnom vlasništvu, od kojih su samo neke, ne sve, na ovim stranicama bile prisutne i prije i nakon rata. Završetkom rata i osnivanjem Lige naroda završava i ovaj višegodišnji izlet uredništva u političko-propagandnim vodama, te se naglo napuštaju teme koje se tiču politike, evropske politike, a uredništvo se ponovno vraća na svoj primarni kolosijek i teme koje se u stvari odnose na geografiju i prirodu. Hvala lijepo.
Hvala. Eto, ostao sam bez mikrofona, ali ne i bez riječi. Znači, hvala Edinu na ovaj interesantan referat, ne samo zbog suštine, nego zbog toga što je pored referata Thomasa Carharta zapravo jedini koji se bavi američkim stajalištima i američkom društvom pre ulaska u rata i za vreme ulaska. No sad imamo nekih dobrih pola sata za diskusiju. So the floor is open, please, colleagues.
Yeah, many thanks to the four panelists for interesting presentations. I have one question to Karl. You talked about the rather obviously wide reception of pictures and films depicting the Balkan wars outside the Balkans. And I wonder whether you can elaborate a little bit about the role of the Balkan wars for for creating a modern aesthetics of war photography. Because of being the first genuinely modern war in Europe, and at the same time taking place at the time when there were new technical possibilities to, for photography, I wonder whether this was also used by international or Western European, North American photographers as a laboratory to create a new imaginary and a new aesthetics of war photography. And in this, I mean, this, if this would be the case, then the Balkans would not play only not only an important role for the development of a specific aesthetics of the photography of relief action and of humanitarian catastrophe, but also of war.
Yeah. Okay, this was Ulf Brumbauer. I would like to ask you to represent, we know him of course, but I would like you to represent, to ask others to represent yourself.
I mean, your question is absolutely good and well posted. I can't give you an answer because, I mean, the problem is one has to collect first published photographs of war and then to analyze them. So since there is no systematic collection of photographs, no answer is possible. For films, there is another problem. I mean, there were many films shot during the wars, but hardly a dozen or so survived. So we only know about filming activities, about number of cameramen and producing companies involved, but we do not have primary evidence. So much has to be done in this regard.
Thank you. Werner Suppanz would like to add something.
Thank you. Yes, I want to add some remarks to your very justified question. In fact, it is interesting, and one has to take into account that the First World War was the first one, and above all on the German side and on the side of the Western powers, where the photography began to replace war paintings, to depict the war, to distribute the image of the war in the course of the First World War. And this was combined with a lot of mise en scène, one could say, because we have a lot of photos that depict war scenes at the front, but none of that scenes, almost none of the scenes was taken during actual fighting, because it was not possible with the technical equipment to fight. But nevertheless, it got so important that you to use that new medium of photography, that the war photographers got the opportunity to take pictures that imitate fighting when the actual fighting was interrupted, to distribute the heroism and titanic, monumental character of that war. So it's probably much more than on the southeastern front or in southeastern Europe, on the western front, the place where photography is the medium number one to depict, to show, to propagate what the war is, but always under the auspices of propaganda, always controlled pictures.
Thank you. Next. Oh, first, you please, yes, here in the middle, you will be second, please. Okay. Stand up, gentlemen, please.
Okay.
No, the first one here, please. Okay.
No problem. No, just one remark about this creating enemy and enemy propaganda. I mean, to get the full dialectics, we have of course also friend propaganda, which is also interesting. By autumn 1914, German professors bring brochures and books and pamphlets finding all kind of nice things about the Ottoman Empire, yeah? Explaining all these prejudices are unjustified and so on, and also on the visual level, yeah? The Sultan on postcards, on coffee cups, and so on. And then it's often interesting some unintended effects, yeah? Because there is a certain critique on imperialism included, of course, as far as British or French imperialism is concerned, but one could, between the lines, also get one step further. Yeah? And also with these portraits of the three imperias. I mean, it is a time when the politicians declared the friendship with Austria on ethnic reasons. But the Sultan is obviously a non-German. So the ethnic ideology is somehow questioned at the same time.
Da, gospodin, mislim da je gospod Karl tamo. Yeah, all right.
Edin? I've got a question.
Edin.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm wondering, have you surveyed other magazines that were coming out at the same time? And the other thing is, I think, have you had a look at the editors of the National Geographic, which political connections they had and how they were situated in the political sphere in the States at the time? And then the other thing is, with the advertisements, I think we have to be quite careful, because I think that they were giving space for advertisement. And the same advertisements were being placed in a very large number of periodicals at the same time. So making a direct connection between a political opinion or what the editors were wanting to say and these advertisements, I think, is a problem. And I think you see that because they had a large number of private advertisements going on all the way through, and even this German American advertisements, so that at a time when there was a lot of, especially when the Americans joined the war, a lot of aggressive action against Germans, and during that period of time. So I think you have to be careful about making a connection there with that. And I would also look at how, perhaps, I would say the statement, how did you I don't know if you've taken a look at how the National Geographic had covered other wars up to that time that the America was involved in, or if you looked at what they were doing about the Balkan War, how this is there a real change, or is it a way of reporting war that they've been using the whole time, or was being used in other press everywhere? So you have a genre that has less to do with directly the National Geographic itself. I don't know if you had a look at that type of thing.
The answer to the first two questions is no. Both of them.
Okay.
Because this is not my main occupation. And to the statement or something, thank you, I will have that in mind while writing the paper.
Okay. Any other?
I would like to thank all the panelists for their most interesting and inspiring papers, and I do have a question to Elisabeth Haid. I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on the whole project you're working on. You said you were presenting an aspect of your PhD with your talk. I'm Natasha Mišković from the University of Basel.
Thanks a lot, Elisabeth.
So in my PhD project, I focus more on Galicia and on the arguments of both sides, why Galicia should be part of their own empire, why it is so important to conquer or protect Galicia, and but I also deal with reports about the consequences of war in Galicia, about destruction, refugees, and so on. Okay.
Okay, we will stay to read it on next conference, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Another comment, questions? Izvoli, Ulf, you will be the second.
Philip Hameršak, Zagreb. I would like to pose only one short question. Were there any regulations forbidding the officers shooting photos for their private purposes? Was there any censorship of these private photos, films, and so on, please?
This is for you,
Yeah, I think so. There were practically no regulations during the First Balkan War. Also, not during the second one, because the second one was too short to establish kind of a procedure. But when World War I started, clear regulations were established. Every war party established a kind of office responsible for media and media control. Private photography was forbidden on all war sites, so only it was forbidden. We don't know whether private photographs were taken, but was prohibited, and the published photographs had to be submitted to the high command of the army.
Of course, but the officers were not forbidden to take photos and take them home after the war. So there was no inspection concerning what was coming home, not to be published from the front.
Yeah, but you needed a license, an official license for photography.
Okay. In what army? All armies?
In all armies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dobro, mikrofon smo spasali, tako da možemo dalje. Ulf je sada. Ulf, please.
A question to Werner. I found your talk really very interesting, and I was not aware of the fact that the Serbian theater of war became perceived as secondary so early on. But you showed us one news clipping, I think it was from the Reichspost from the fall of 1914, where they say, well, strategically Serbia is not so important, but that's our own personal war, it's about emotions, about revenge, but whether we take Belgrade or not, it's from the overall point of view not so important. I mean, one could also ask whether this was a reflection of the fact that the war was not going so well at that time. So it was a deliberate effort to say, well, even if we lose this thing, well, it's not so important at all. So don't worry. We can lose that, but we will have our revenge and our sort of own emotional catharsis. But losing or winning is not the question in this war.
But, okay. Well, in part, this was certainly an element of the development, but I think the more important aspect was that above all, the war against Russia at that time was considered the one, as Elisabeth Haid has described, the one where the real important decisions will come into reality. The antagonism of different cultures, of different cultural standards, and so on. And so that's, and of course, as military menace, Russia was much more important than Serbia. And I think that these two factors influenced the development much more than the process in the Serbian campaign.
Well, Carsten Pledelius, Copenhagen. Thank you for particularly the presentation of this Austrian newspaper articles, which were really shocking. And one understands the feelings of Serbs regarding the First World War, which has been part of the building up of nationalism in the 1980s. The memory of what happened then, suppressed memory from that time. But I wonder of another medium, the cartoons. Because if you look at German and Austrian cartoons, particularly from 1903 and onwards, there is so much nasty material demonizing the Serbs, making them Untermensch civilization in some way. So in some way, I think that these feelings are reflected in the behavior of awful behavior of that Hauptmann, which you presented here, that in some way negative feelings about Serbia and about Orthodox actually has been building up in the previous centuries. But I would like your and Elisabeth's comment on that.
Okay, who will be first?
Yes. Okay. You are absolutely right, and what I want to stress in this context is that all these stereotypes of the dehumanized barbarians, is what written there, could not be invented in 1914. There was a long tradition of Balkanism, as Maria Todorova and others have investigated it, and so it was rather an activation of certain images than an invention. And one mustn't forget that in the course of the interwar period during World War II, all these images were rather intensified. And that's another point I want to stress, that we have really a colonial look on parts of Europe. We can observe that not only on the Serbian case, but on some other examples. So colonialism, the colonial perspective, was not exclusive to other continents, to Africa or parts of Asia, but also we have in some parts of Europe, not only Austria, that colonial look on Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe.
Thank you for this remark. Well, it's like the same with Russia. Also, Russian barbarians was an old stereotype that was just intensified. And also a short remark about the question of about the of course it's true, Russia from a military perspective was the more important enemy, but I also think that the cause of the war plays a role. You can also see about the reporting on the Russian front. So when the battle in Galicia was going on, it was depicted as a decisive battle, and after defeat in Galicia, this importance of this battle was relativized, and so they said, no, it's not the end of the war, there will be decisive battle later on, and it's not so important, this defeat. So I think that's playing a role also here.
A short remark to yours. One mustn't forget the war on Russia was the one where all the political camps in Austria could be unified. If you read, for example, the Social Democrat reactions on the assassination of the Archduke, you can often read the tendency, okay, an assassination, a crime, but it's not worth making war because of that reason. But on Russia, also the Social Democrats were ready to wage war, because there we had the element, the barbarian, backward Russia, the Tsarist oppression versus the West, where the labor class is beginning to emancipate itself much more than in the backward Russia. The Christian socialists had the Catholic versus Orthodox opposition, and the German nationals had the Germans versus Slavs opposition. So it was by far easier to unite all the political camps, to unite all the population behind the army in the case of the war in Russia.
Well, not to forget, not just Russian barbarians, drunken Russian barbarians, you know. So we have now two ladies, first on the right. Yeah.
Svetlana Soveka, Moldova State University in Chisinau. It's a question for Elisabeth. I was wondering whether you can depict in the newspapers the echoing of these war issues with the administrative challenges Russians faced in Galicia in 14, 15, considering the fact that the Austrian laws remained and the Austrian even public servants were at a certain time at the beginning encouraged to stay in place and serve. While remaining switching his loyalty to the Russian side. Obviously, many left, but some remained. And I was thinking whether there was a reaction from inside Galicia, but also from the Russian side. In Duma, it was the question that was discussed. On the harsh measures imposed in Galicia and the effects it had. So I'm wondering whether you have depicted in the newspaper this tension between the implementation of administrative measure and the encouragement to go to war on the Russian side.
I'm not sure if I understand you. Your question was about press reporting about the Russian occupation in Galicia?
Yeah, so I was wondering whether it's not only encouragement to go to war, you mentioned, and opposing to Austrian goals, but also the way the administration was imposed in the region and what reactions it brought from inside.
So the Austrian reaction about the
not Austrian but local reaction.
Local?
Yeah. Galicia, yeah.
So you mean Polish, Ukrainian population?
Yeah. That's what I mean.
Okay. What was the reaction of Polish, Ukrainian and other population in this occupied territory? Do you have any impression?
The Polish-Ukrainian reaction on the occupation in Galicia.
They didn't like Austrians, I can tell you that.
Well, it was of course quite different depending on population groups. So there was a certain collaboration with this occupation regime, of course, by Russophile part of the Ukraine of the Ruthenian population, but also parts of the Polish administration collaborated with this regime. But on the other hand, a large part of the population was not satisfied with the new regime. In the Polish case, especially because Eastern Galicia clearly was regarded by the new regime as a Russian territory with a Russian population, and they promoted a restriction of the Polish rights in this territory, and the more the Russian regime opposed Ukrainian Ukrainian national movements, Ukrainian language, the Greek Catholic Church. There were attempts to conversion to the Orthodox Church, and so also many Ruthenians rejected this sometimes also violent repressions against Ukrainian language, Greek Catholic Church. And of course there was repression against Jews, so especially many Jews were refugees who went to Vienna, for example.
Well, I doubt that they were allowed to express any feelings. It was strong censorship, but you can find some impressions through memoirs of soldiers and so on. We have now time, I guess, only for 2 more questions, so please here and then you. Oh, there are 3, sorry. Okay, we will try to put this in the last 5 minutes.
The microphone is on.
Dođi ovamo i kaži ovdje, evo, to će biti najlakše. Imamo još jedno koliko ćemo se držati. Ajde.
Just a short question for you, maybe a comment, take it as you like. You mentioned in your paper, it's a question about the terms you used in your paper. You said Galician Russians, Russians, or Ukrainians. So during the First World War, the Ukrainian name was established as the national name. And before that, you know that the Russian name was established as the national name, as an old name. So I think you should be very precise about the using the terms. I know you picked up the terms from the literature and sources, but I think taking in account the fact that Ukrainian name was established as the national name by that time, in spite of the fact that the national integration, Ukrainian integration, was not finished. But I think we should decide which term will we use. So, because a Russian name by that time was limited to Zakarpatska Oblast only during the First World War. And Ukrainian name was actually established in Galicia during the First World War. So maybe you should just mention in your footnote that fact. So when you use the terms, I think we should be very much exact about which name will we use in the paper and when we talk about the subject. So that was just a comment and a suggestion for you. Thank you.
Thank you, we will take it as a comment. We have just now 2 more, please.
Violeta Herman Kaulić, Hrvatski institut za povijest. U principu htjela bih zahvaliti svima izlagačima zato što su u osnovi pokazali ono što je odlika ovoga rata. Sve strane radile su ono što su smatrali potrebnim da bi ostvarile svoje ciljeve. To se pokazalo na primjeru Amerike, Austrije u Balkanskim ratu, na Prvom svjetskom ratu, Austrije i u Rusiji i u Srbiji. Međutim, ne treba zaboraviti da su istu stvar radili i druga strana. To su radili Italijani, to su radili naročito i Srbi, kako bi pokazali opravdanost svoje borbe. Naprosto, u tom ratu se nisu birala sredstva da bi se ostvarila pobjeda. I hvala vam svima što su u osnovi to i pokazali. Što je samo komentarno.
Dobro, hvala. Evo, ne, on, ima još.
Well, Petar Todorov, Institute of National History from Skopje. I have one question. Actually, I'm curious and I want to hear for Werner Suppanz. But this image of Balkanism, the Serbians are not the only one, that not the sole people, a nation to this image of Balkanism. So the Bulgarians are too. The Turks, of course. So I'm interested in how the Bulgarians were perceived in Austria during the war. So how this image of Balkanism, I mean, actually, is there any changes before 1915 and after 1915 when Bulgaria became allied to Austro-Hungarian Empire? So how this fit to the general image of Balkanism, and so if any changes, if the Bulgarians were perceived as a good, how they explained these changes of being sometimes bad and now not being good, because Bulgarians were allies.
I didn't understand the last one. Which changes?
So if there is any changes in the image of Bulgarians,
yes.
So how they explain this? How now former barbarians became good and because of being allies to Austro-Hungarian Empire. So if I know that you were talking about Serbia, so but I'm interested more about this image with the Bulgarians.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. First of all, I want to add something to your first remark. Of course, we can state enemy images of that kind on every side, but there is a difference between the sporadic use and the systematic use, which you can observe only on certain cases, like the Serbs, for example. It is interesting, and that fits into what we told about the colonial look. We have similar images also on French and British soldiers, but only to the French and British colonial soldiers. They are described with the same attributes like the Serbs as a whole, and that's, in my opinion, a quite significant observation. That's the first point. I wanted to say the second point, how to, well, often these changes are not explained. They are not justified, they are simply not explained. If they are explained, it's mostly with the long course of history.